Hey guys, welcome to my channel. My name is ReadingBear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we'll take a look at some new entitled people content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comment. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
The first story is titled, Ex-neighbor constantly blocked my parking spot. I got her towed. She threatened to sue me. So, I live in an apartment complex with pretty crappy parking. Parking in a city is never fun, but when you only have about 10 parking spaces for your complex, it made it pretty difficult. My apartment complex was actually an old 3-story house that had been converted into an apartment complex with about 8 units. So, even though there was only 8 units, let us say each unit has 2 cars and well, you can do the math. It is not adding up. At all. So, the parking spaces that were assigned to the complex were free. There were parking spaces across the street, but those were considered city parking spaces, and you had to pay coins in order to use them. Obviously, no one wants to do that because even though it was cheap, if you parked your car there every night, it would start to add up. Well, my neighbor took advantage of this. After she moved out. Hear me out. So, the girl who lived in the unit next to me had recently gotten a new job during this time. Her new job was about a 10-minute walk down the street. This worked out great for her. Because we lived a city, everywhere you had to pay for parking or have a parking pass. So, if she would have drove her car to work, then she would have to pay for parking by her work. Since she lived just down the street, she walked and saved money by keeping her car in our little parking lot. Well, about 2 or 3 months after her new job, she had saved enough money to move to a nice part of town. We did not live in the bad part of town, but it was not the safest either. Either way, I thought this was silly because if she waited a year or so, she could have saved up so much money. Especially because now, she was moving, she would have to start paying for parking. Well, that is what I thought anyway. See, after she moved out of the apartment, I noticed that her car would appear in her old spot in the morning. She was driving her car here in the morning, and then going to work so she would not have to pay for parking. It was annoying, but I figured it was harmless because no one had moved into her old unit yet. A few weeks later, a nice couple finally did move into her unit, so I expected to not see her car parked there anymore. I mean, I was half right. It was not parked in her old spot anymore. It was parked in mine. I commuted about 15 minutes to work, so obviously I did not have the luxury of leaving my car at the apartment complex and just walking. However, one night I noticed when I came home from work that her car was parked in my spot. I was going to tell her something, until I realized that she was nowhere to be found and was at work. With it being nighttime, I was ready to go to bed, and had no choice but to park across the street and pay for overnight parking. This happened several more times, and I was progressively getting more and more irritated. She was always at work when I was coming home, so I could never directly confront her. During this time, I found out I was pregnant with my first child. My fiancé and I were ecstatic, but as the first trimester developed, I was getting more and more tired. I considered leaving a note on her car, but I did not want this to be some petty fight. I wanted to speak to her face to face. One night I got off work, tired and my feet were starting to swell, thanks, restaurant life. And of course when I got home, her damn car was in my spot again. My fiancé was not home yet, and I was just so irritated, that I called an emergency towing company, and they came out and got her car. I felt slightly guilty, but then I realized how dumb that was. I had been paying for parking at my house because she felt entitled to my spot for whatever reason. Well, this did not sit well with her. Because at about 6 a.m. the next morning, she came pounding on our door. My fiancé had opened it and was immediately met with our ex-neighbor was screaming and crying. Yes, crying. I went to see what all the commotion was about, and she was terribly upset and wanted to know where her car was. I told her straight up that I called a towing company to get her car, because it was parked in my spot. I was tired of having to put money in a machine every night for parking. Besides that, I was pregnant and did not feel like walking across the street to park. Is that such a crime? It is. She began yelling at us that she could not afford parking and that she needed to use this space. I told her that I was tired from my shift last night, and that she needed to leave the complex before I called the landlord and told him that she had been illegally parking in our parking lot. This enraged her even more, and she said that she was going to sue us for towing her car, because she did not her car to get to work and now, she did not have any way to even go pick it up from the tow yard. I told her to order an Uber and slam the door shut in her face. The next day, my fiancé had told me that one of this girl's friend had messaged him via social media and told him what bad people we were. That we left her stranded and she was struggling to pay rent, so that is why she could not afford to park at her own work. Listen, I consider myself to Eb pretty empathetic, but she should have thought about that before she moved apartments and thought she could afford rent in the rich part of town. Not only that, but she also did not even come speak to us to see if she could park in our spot or anything like that. If she would have come and spoke to us directly, instead of just assuming, we could have figured something out. But she was just so bratty and entitled, and now she was getting her friends to message us? My fiancé blocked her friend. We have not heard from her since, nor has our ex-neighbor showed back up to park in our parking space. I have no idea if she got her car back from the tow yard, and to be quite honest, I really do not care. That is her problem. Oh, and she never actually sued us. Never mess with a pregnant lady. The next story is titled, My Parents and Sister Feared Their Only Neighbor for 5 Years. He sued or threatened to sue everyone he could. He made it personal for me when he put a gun to my dog's head to show his dominance. TLDR. Never put a gun to my golden retriever's head. My parents feared for their safety but could never find a legal way to prove what he did to my family. I was patient for years trying to find a legal way to make an asshole like John lose almost everything in his life. Around 8 years ago, my parents and sister had moved out to the log cabin that we built as a family for 6+ years. They live on a secluded lake and bought 10 acres for themselves, and to the north, another couple bought the 5-acre plot right next to us. We were the only 2 neighbors next to each other for 1.8 miles. At first the couple was friendly and had no problems at all. After around 6 months of them living there and building their new home, my parents bought 144 acres to the north of them. This means that his property is sandwiched between our 2 properties. And since the only way we could get to our land is to cross his strip of land due to easement laws. He had no problem at first, but one day the trail we used to get to our land to the north was covered that trail with large logs, branches, yellow tape, and a no trespassing sign. My dad went to go ask what was going on. The owner, we'll call him John, came up to my dad and I and demanded that we give him a 20-yard wide and 400-yard long piece of our property to the north of him. He said wanted to cut down some of the trees to the north of him to make sure none of them fell on his house. This is a thickly wooded area. So of course, my dad said no, and that he wouldn't even sell this small portion of land that he requested to be given to him for free. We will find out at the end of the story as to why he wanted this small strip of land so badly. This is where a 5-year shitstorm started. Before I mention all the batshit crazy things he had done to use over the years, I want to point out that he is a born fraud and took a settlement from the railroad company he worked for due to a back injury that would leave him disabled for life. Not true at all. We found out that he sues everyone that gets in his way, because his oldest daughter is a lawyer and works the system. Here is a small list of the crap he has pulled mainly towards my parents, along with others. He had gotten away with everything for 5 years, because his daughter tells him how to stay in the clear. Also, he was on his 5th marriage, so not the most likable guy. He slashed the tires of our 2 4-wheelers so we could drive them to our land to the north, on 2 occasions. He shot out and or slashed the tires of our vehicles when we were gone or in the middle of the night. We put up some cameras but were not clear enough to prove it was him. Don't ducking threaten my dog's life. My golden retriever, Bailey, is outside most of the day, and John's dog is also named Bailey. The 2 dogs loved to play together, but John did not like that. He said he would shoot my dog in the stomach if he ever went on his property again. After that, weeks later he would start to yell out, "Bailey," to lure our dog onto his property. He grabbed my dog by the collar and put a pistol to his head and said he'd kill my dog if he ever came on his property again or played with his dog. We put up an underground electric fence so she wouldn't go over there anymore, even though John would always try to lure her into his yard. On several occasions he would golf balls into our windows and blame it on me, since I was a golfer. Once again everything he did, we could not prove it in court. When his house was being built, he went through 3 different contractors, because John was threatening to sue every contractor for every little thing and all 3 contractors left him. When he was getting his driveway poured, he offered to help the contractor, and once again he was pulling another scam. Where I live, if someone starts helping a contractor with work, there is a weird law that states that a contractor would need to pay John for his work he helped with. This went to court, and he got his $10,000 driveway for free, plus took him for another $15,000 grand for some other bullshit. We too were in the process of finishing up my parents' house and he stole very specific wood from our place to use in his house: juniper, diamond willow, thick pine for window bucks, a couple $1,000s worth of wood. Once again, we did not have enough evidence for a search warrant. During Thanksgiving dinner several years ago, our house started on fire due to the stonemason cutting corners and using cheap, wrong parts for our fireplace. Firefighters from 5 cities were dispatched, because we live in the country. Due to the amount of fire trucks that were coming and going, John took his truck and parked it sideways on a strip of road that was tight so that the firefighters coming and going could not get through. He stated that we were ruining their Thanksgiving due to the commotion of our house burning down and fire truck sirens. The next fire truck that showed up used the force within their rights to plow his truck off the road. John tried to sue us and the fire department for the damage to his truck, but it never even made it to court, because the fire department had the rights to do so. What I listed above only scratched the surface. There is so much more shit he did to my family that my mom and sister wanted to move, because they were afraid of what he might do next. This is where all of the pieces started to fall in place to take him down. The spring after our house burnt down, there was a storm and 2 trees from our property fell onto John's lawn and he called demanding that we remove the trees. We had no equipment at this time, told him we couldn't get to that immediately. So, what John did was cut down a 20 by 40 yard area of trees to drag the trees to our property to the north of him. Later he set the pile of wood on fire and burnt down 20 plus more trees and 20 acres of prairie grass. One of the trees that burned down to the north was inhabited by a bald eagle. We could confirm the cutting down of 24 trees to drag the fallen trees that were in his yard but couldn't prove the fire that was started to burn those sawed-up trees. When I saw that he had cut down a number of our trees on our property to the north of him, I took detailed photos of all the cut-down trees and marked the type of tree and how thick the trunks were. Turns out that in my state there is a monetary value to those trees, and he was screwed. However, when I was marking the trees he cut down, I realized I didn't know where the true property line was. A few weeks later I found the prints to where the property line was and he built his house, 5,000 square feet garage and underground propane tank a few feet onto our property. So now we found out why he wanted that land so bad, before we would figure it out. Now during this time, John had put his house up for sale and put a $120,000 markup on what the actual market price was. We found out why he was doing this, because he and a friend had gambled a lot of their savings on buying the property around a lake and they were selling no lots. He was bleeding money. We were finally able to put a lien on his house and that was his only lifeline to get cash to make their land payments. To make the rest of this story go by faster, I'll skip to the part where we ended up buying his house. We told him to put the price back down to market value, and then my father said that we could either settle the price of the trees, out of court, that he cut down of ours, and he agreed to settle that in the price of the house. My dad also identified the stolen wood, and we could trace it back to the same unique wood in our house. We would sue him for that too, or he could drop the price for stealing our materials. Lastly, because John was such an asshole, my dad used the leverage of the lien we had on his house to drop the value even more. John was bleeding money and was desperate for anything. So, in the end my parents bought his house for 28% of its market value. John's 4th wife would end up leaving him a year later. He filed for bankruptcy, lost his land development area since he was upside down on the payments, and now lives in a cheap studio apartment alone. The last story is titled, "Nightmare Neighbor Nearly Sets Our Building on Fire." This just happened and I'm still shaking and pissed. I'm just going to say quick, we've had issue with this guy since we moved in. He smokes in his non-smoking apartment, having screaming matches with God knows who at all hours of the night. He's always out of his mind on something and has had some questionable people lease from him illegally. The landlord has served him an eviction notice, but we're in Ontario, Canada, and things like that move very slowly here. Now for today. It was about 9 a.m. and I'm just finishing up my cup of coffee after I put my youngest down for a nap. When I started to smell burning plastic, instantly I go on high alert and start checking our vents, just in case one of my kids put something down there they shouldn't have, but I found nothing. I then followed the smell to the front door that goes out to the shared hallway. Open it only for smoke to start bellowing into my apartment. I quickly realized that the smoke was coming from my neighbor's place. I yelled up the stairs at him to see if he was home. I got no answer. I ran up the stairs and pounded on the door calling his name. As I'm doing so, the door just flung open. It wasn't locked or closed properly. More smoke came out making me cough and hack and my eyes burn. I yelled for him one more time before turned tail and ran downstairs figuring he wasn't home. I then went into mama survival mode. Before I was even back in my apartment, I was on the phone with 911. Quick note. I was home alone with all 3 of my kids who are all under 3. I grab my kids and go out the back just as the fire department shows up. They go in and come out a few minutes later, and who comes out with them? You guessed it, my neighbor with his 2-year kid. They were in there the whole time. He was so strung out on whatever he was doing he didn't hear the fire alarms or me screaming at him that the place was on fire. He was woken up by the firemen. I went off when I saw him. Up until now my husband has dealt with him because I'm not a confrontational person, but not only did he put my children and me in danger, he almost got his own son killed over a habit. And the mama bear in me just snapped. I screamed, I yelled, I probably would have hit him, but I ended up being led away by a firefighter. I told all of this to the fire chef and the police. The neighbor and his son were taken to hospital for smoke exposure. The police are getting CAS involved because of the obvious child endangerment. Luckily the fire was out quickly, and we were given all clear to go back into our apartment. Now I'm writing this just trying to calm down and hope this incident speeds up this jerk eviction. We'll update as I get more info. Thank you for listening.